Hello, and thank you for joining me today for this presentation of Are We Prisoners of Our Language and Culture? My name is Barry Jackson, a Professor Emeritus and Fulbright Senior Scholar. The presentation today is divided into 4 sections. The full paper will be available soon for publication. At the end of this video, you'll be able to access my contact information, and you may contact me at your pleasure. Thank you. Are we prisoners of our language and culture? Perception of reality, subjective and objective epistemologies. Barry L. Jackson, PhD, Professor Emeritus, Fulbright Senior Scholar. I've organized this presentation into 4 basic sections. Due to time constraints, I cannot present all of the aspects of the paper on which this presentation is based. However, the full content will be published shortly. You may contact me at the information provided at the end of this presentation. Human perception and a desire to communicate that perception are the basis for the creation of languages. When something is perceived and a mental image is then created to give that perception some meaning, that perception is assigned a symbol, a sound, to represent it, and the sound is then used to communicate that perception to someone else. When the first primitive symbols were strung together, we saw the beginning of language. That's when language emerged. Language is a composite of mental symbols, mental images, if you will, each assigned a sound that we both say within our heads as we think, and which we make verbal in order for others to understand us. The sounds or words convey a message generally understood by other members of our group. This general understanding becomes a part of the common social construct, a construct that we all share. If I say the word house, we all have some basic idea of what a house is. Its exact structure may vary from culture to culture, but we know it's a dwelling in which people, and sometimes our dogs, live in. It could be made of wood, stones, bricks, or more primitive materials. It may be a round shape, square, a one-level, a multi-level. Each society and culture has its own idea of what constitutes a house. A language develops its shape from our perceptions, and that shape contributes to the future understanding of perceptions through the consolidation of the perception into an existing category of a constructed meaning. So if I say house to you, you understand what a house is. If I say a roof on a house, then you know what a house is and you put the concept of roof to that house. So it constructs a series of meanings interconnected. In this way, a culture is consolidated and it directs both our thoughts and our behaviors. So the content of language is a subjective representation of an objective perception. So we objectively see something. There's something out there to be seen. But how we interpret it is somewhat subjective based on our culture. The content of language is a subjective representation of an objective perception, and it doesn't reflect reality, but it's an image of what we think reality is. A culture's language does not reflect reality, Tebaldo says, rather it creates it. We acquire our understanding of reality through our inherited language, complete with its embedded cultural images and abstract constructs. The well-known Romanian sociologist Henri H. Stahl wrote that one cannot escape that inherited language because thought is conducted in language. Language, thought, and culture are inextricably woven together. Tierney and others tell us that words evoke meanings and emotions, construct how we think, and even how the brain grows and processes the perceptions it takes in and the information it has. In this way, it shapes how we interpret future perceptions. The language we speak can be used to create stories complete with culturally understood meanings, not necessarily understood by non-members of the inherited culture or language. Kordaki said that stories are the principal means of passing on culture, traditions, and beliefs to the next generation of the society. As stories are changed, so too is culture changed. In this way, our cultures evolve. David Morgan posited the concept of what is called a covenant of perception between an object perceived and the perceiver. The culture embedded in the language we use provides rules for interpreting the perception. These rules tell us how reality is to be understood. It creates expectations on our part, and these expectations are a promise of what will come. That's the perception covenant. We know how to respond or how to behave in confronted with a perception based on an event and previous experience. Perception is dependent on two elements. First is the element of the information received from our senses. Second is the predictions regarding the perceptions inherent. Now, these predictions come from past experience and from our language and the culture that's embedded in the language. So we know how to understand a perception within a specific cultural meaning. Our understanding of reality then is generated within a collective culture. The objective world is not passively received, but is generated by this collective culture. Perception then is a process of informed guesswork. We're guessing, basically, based on past experience, what to experience next. So the brain links perceptions with pre-existing expectations and pre-existing experience about the world and how it works. These expectations are uniquely formed within our own collective culture, so that from one culture to another, we have different understandings of even the same words, so that we anticipate different things and we fill in the blank information as we go along. This is what we find ourselves doing. Now, there may be a real objective world to perceive, but we are prone to subjective error. How we interpret things makes errors. Perceptions are understood subjectively and are transformed into objectified symbols encapsulating the entire sense of our cultural history. So that we see something, we interpret it based on our past experience and past images that we've given a name, and then we interpret that new information. It doesn't necessarily reflect the reality or the true sense of nature. Hoffman has quite an article on this that you can find in the bibliography at the end. Now, this is all partly due to the brain paying greatest attention to those things that are most likely to help us survive within our culture and are situationally relevant. So how reality is viewed is culturally inherited through language, learned in infancy, and because it's embedded in the language and the thoughts are embedded with the language and the experiences, the individual can't be free of these things in the abstract construct. So the abstract construct cannot be removed from our language and our thought processes. Plato's allegory of the cave probably best illustrates this point. People are chained to a wall all of their lives, facing the wall. They see only the wall and the shadows projected onto the wall as objects pass behind them but in front of a light. These shadows become their sense of reality. For them, the shadows are real. I want to give some examples of subjective reality misinterpretations, and there are three general categories: jump oil, optical illusion, and closure. I'm going to go through each one of these. The perceiver expects to see something and therefore does, based on one of these three subjective misinterpretation categories. Camouflage is a second form of trump oil in a way, and I'm going to illustrate these in a moment. So here are two examples of Tromboil. I'd like you to look closely at those and think about them and tell me what you think about it. What do you see? Did you see the curtain behind the settee? Did you realize that it's painted onto the wall? It's not real. And in case of the bookshelves, which books are real, which ones aren't? How much of the cabinet itself, the shelving itself, is real? Which of these domes is the real one? The one on the left, the one on the right? Where is this dome painted? Dome ceiling painted? Well, this is the dome in St. Stephen's Basilica in Budapest, so it's the real one. This is the fake one. It's painted on a flat ceiling, and it was done sometime before 1709. In what country or city is this war-torn building found? In fact, it's not a derelict building at all. It's just painted on a wall. Which figure in this picture is the tallest? In fact, they're all the same height. They're all exactly the same measurement. It's perception that gives us the sense that things are a different size or the same size. Which of these lines is longer? That's right, they're all the same length. If you stare at the center of this and move your eyes slightly, does this graphic seem to move? For many people, it does. Can you see the woman in this picture? Do you see anything else? Now, I'd like you to try to solve this puzzle. I want you to connect the 9 dots using 4 straight lines or less without lifting your pencil from the paper and without retracing your path. I'll give you about a minute to look at this and see if you can calculate the correct answer. Has anybody gotten it? Well, let me give you some hints here. If you draw that line outside of the box, and the next one outside of the box, that's your 4 lines. The term in psychology is called closure. We look at these 4 lines. They go outside of the box. 3 of them do. But the box is a mental image. We look at 9 dots, symmetrically laid out, same distance, equidistant from each other, and we assume that it's a square. And because we assume it's a square, we do not go outside of the box, and we try to solve the problem within that square. I've shown this puzzle to people and then shown it to them the next day, and they still couldn't fix it, even though they were given a solution the day before. We need to literally think outside of the box. There's also an anatomical reason for closure. Each eye of the human eye has a blind spot where the optic nerve connects to the back of the retina and therefore goes into the brain. We do not perceive the absence of information in this area. It's blind because there are no receptacle for sight itself. There's no light receptacles there. They are rather the optic nerve connection. And all that information is fed into the optic nerve on the retina and back to the brain. We don't perceive the blind spot because the human brain fills in the missing information based on what we expect should be there. We anticipate what we should see, and we literally fill that information in. It's not uncommon for people to say, I just didn't see it. Well, they may not have just not seen it because, in fact, their eye didn't pick up the information. It wasn't visible to them. Rather, it was filled in by what they expected to see. Some other activities of the brain worth mentioning are depth perception and proprioception. We're not born with either depth perception or proprioception. Psychology experiments have shown that babies put on a glass table, do not perceive the edge of the table. If allowed, they would simply crawl off and fall down. They are unable to recognize the difference in the levels of the table. Now, if you ever observe a child, a baby, learning to walk, you might ask yourself, why do they keep watching their feet? Why do they look at their feet? Well, the brain has to connect the sensation of touching the ground with the foot with the brain. This is called proprioception. Have you ever walked through a doorway? Do you look on both sides to see if your shoulders are going to go through? No, but sometimes when you're really tired, you walk through and you bump your shoulder, or if you've had a bit much to drink, you bump your shoulder because you've lost what's called proprioception. When you get dizzy, that happens to you. You don't know where you are. You find it difficult to stand still. The brain has learned the outer limits of the body, and we no longer have to consciously think about it. We immediately assess the situation, and we walk through the open doorway. We stand straight. We know where our feet are without looking at them. All of this happens as a function of unconscious behavior of the brain. The brain does this same exact principle when it comes to dealing with information that we perceive in other areas and we transmit into language within our thoughts. So the question posed in the title of this presentation talks about different ways of knowing things, the epistemology. And the question here really is, can we know an objective reality independent of our language and culture that we inherit? Well, Morgan and others, Hoffman, O'Sullivan, Paulson, all say no, we can't. There is clearly an objective reality out there, but we learn about that objective reality through a subjective means. We learn it through our language, which we inherit. So can objective reality ever really be known? The answer is no, we can't. We only know it objectively. So there's an objective and a subjective reality. The objective reality is what science claims it knows. So we usually think of science as an objective thing. But science in itself is its own culture, and it has its own embedded language and its own embedded rules within that language. So in a real sense, science, observation, empirical, data collection, whatever you want to call it or title it, collects information in the same way that we call subjective reality. We see the information, we interpret it, and our rules of science tell us how to interpret it. Things like atoms, neutrons, electrons. They are all invented words to help science explain what it sees, what it observes. In a way, it is no more objective than religion or magic, superstition, or spirituality, which are frequently called subjective or soft sciences, maybe. So the images found in the empirical or objective realm spring from experience and are depicted in scientific terms. These terms are based upon assumptions about how things work, just the same as the so-called subjective sciences. The logic of the empirical or scientific methodologies then follows assumptions, and without further need for supporting evidence, they move forward. One of the interesting things I find is that scientists have said that all things can be explained through particle observation in quantum physics. Well, it's interesting that gravity has yet to be identified. It's not a particle. They haven't found a particle. At best, they're saying perhaps two gluons get together and that creates gravity. But they really don't know. And so gravity is unexplained. We've been told that light is the fastest thing in the universe, and yet light can't escape a great black hole because of gravity. So we don't know everything, nor do we expect to know everything anytime soon. I have some interesting conclusions to make here. If one accepts the empirical, objective, linguistic, embedded language culture as the only way to know reality, then there's only one outcome. That's the scientific outcome. But science begins, like religion, as I've said, with a perception. Rupert Sheldrake, a famous British biologist, made an interesting observation. He said, modern science is based on the principle, and I quote, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest of things. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all matter and all energy in the universe and all the languages that govern them from nothing in a single instance. The same might be said of magic or religion, except the premise that there are magical beings or a divinity and all things can be explained. Carl Sagan once said that the notion that science and spirituality are somehow mutually exclusive does a disservice to both of them, that there is more in common than we think. They both begin with an observation. They both proceed to make some explanation, to make meaning of that observation, that perception. And from there, they try to explain the universe. A colleague of mine, Dr. John Hovorka, a former professor of physics and NASA scientist, once told me that it was easier to accept intelligent design than to believe that all of this happened by accident alone. So scientific objectivity, in my opinion, is illusory. It's based on assumptions that explain perceptions and try to make sense of reality. No different than the so-called subjective sciences. It is its own culture, its own language, from which scientists cannot escape. The so-called subjective realms of religion, spirituality, magic have the same perceptions, but they interpret them differently based on different perspectives and different inherent cultural assumptions. Reality cannot be understood free of our embedded language and cultures. That is true. Objective and subjective are simply a false dichotomy. Objective sciences are simply another means of explaining the universe, the reality of which we cannot fully know. Reality may exist, but can we truly know it? I don't think so. Thank you very much for your attention.